I thought I knew everything about my family until one phone call that wasn't really a phone call changed my entire life forever. My name is Emma, and I'm 28 years old. I teach third grade at Lincoln Elementary, and I've been married to my husband Jake for 3 years. Jake is a graphic designer who rarely gets emotional about anything, which is why what happened next completely blindsided me. For as long as I can remember, my family has been incredibly close. There's my mom, Sarah, who works as a bank manager and has always been the glue that holds our family together. She's 49 and just celebrated her birthday with the dinner from hell that I'm about to tell you about. My dad, Greg, is 51 and works in construction as a foreman. He's the kind of man who taught me how to change a tire and always made sure I knew I could do anything I set my mind to. Then there's my younger sister, Katie, who's 25 and works as a veterinary technician. She's always been the free spirit of the family. But the person this story is really about is Michael. Michael is 52 years old, and for my entire life, he's been introduced as my mom's cousin from Denver. He's never been married, never had kids of his own, but he's been at every single important moment in my life. Every birthday party, every school play, every graduation, every major holiday. Michael would fly in from Denver without fail, always bringing thoughtful gifts that somehow perfectly matched whatever I was interested in at the time. When I was 7 and obsessed with dinosaurs, Michael showed up with a complete set of dinosaur encyclopedias. When I decided I wanted to be a teacher in high school, he gave me a beautiful leather-bound journal with my initials on it and told me to write down all my teaching ideas. When Jake and I got engaged, Michael was one of the first people we called, and he cried on the phone when we told him the news. Looking back now, I realized there were signs that something was different about Michael's relationship with our family. He always seemed to know things about me that even my parents sometimes forgot. He remembered that I was allergic to strawberries when I was 5, something that even I had forgotten. He knew that my favorite color had changed from purple to green in middle school. He always asked detailed questions about my teaching career and seemed genuinely invested in every small success I had in the classroom. Michael also had this habit of watching me during family gatherings, not in a creepy way, but with this intense focus that I always attributed to him being a bachelor who enjoyed being around family. He would smile when I laughed, and his eyes would get watery when I talked about my students or my marriage. I thought he was just emotional about being part of our family traditions. The night that changed everything was Mom's 49th birthday dinner. Michael had flown in from Denver specifically for the celebration, which wasn't unusual, but something felt different from the moment he walked through the door. He seemed nervous, almost anxious, which was completely out of character for him. Michael had always been calm and steady, the kind of person who could handle any situation with grace. During dinner, Michael kept staring at me when he thought I wasn't looking. When Mom started telling stories about when I was little, Michael's reactions seemed more intense than usual. When she mentioned teaching me to ride a bike, Michael's eyes filled with tears. When she talked about my first day of kindergarten, Michael excused himself to go to the bathroom, and I could swear I heard him crying in the hallway. But the moment that should have been my first real clue was when Michael gave Mom her birthday gift. It was an expensive silver bracelet, far more expensive than anything a cousin would typically give. Mom's reaction was strange too. She looked at the bracelet like it meant something deeper than just a birthday present, and she hugged Michael for way longer than a normal cousin hug. Jake noticed it too. I could see him watching the interaction between Michael and my parents, with a puzzled expression. Jake has always been observant, probably from his work as a graphic designer where he has to notice small details. But that night, he seemed to be studying my family like he was trying to solve a puzzle. What I didn't know was that Michael had been carrying a secret for 28 years, and that birthday dinner was the night he finally decided he couldn't carry it anymore. What I didn't know was that my entire understanding of who I was and where I came from was about to be shattered by a conversation that would happen in our backyard just an hour later. The phone call that wasn't really a phone call was just the beginning of the most shocking night of my life. My life before that birthday dinner felt like something out of a storybook. I had everything I thought I wanted and a family that most people would envy. Teaching third grade at Lincoln Elementary wasn't just my job, it was my calling. I'd recently received tenure, which meant I finally had the job security I'd been working toward for 5 years. My classroom was filled with bright-eyed 8-year-olds who made me laugh every single day, and I genuinely loved going to work each morning. Jake and I had built what I considered the perfect marriage. We'd met in college when he was studying graphic design and I was working on my education degree. He was the calm, steady type who balanced out my more emotional nature. While I wore my heart on my sleeve, Jake was the kind of person who thought things through carefully before reacting. He designed logos and marketing materials for small businesses, and he was incredibly talented at reading people and situations, which made him excellent at understanding what his clients really wanted. Our little house on Maple Street was exactly what we'd dreamed of when we got married. We'd painted every room ourselves, planted a garden in the backyard, and spent weekends antiquing to find the perfect furniture. Jake had converted the spare bedroom into his design studio, and I had my corner where I graded papers and planned lessons. We talked about kids someday, but for now, we were content with our life together. Family dinners at my parents' house were a monthly tradition that I looked forward to more than anything else. Mom and Dad lived in the same house where Katie and I grew up, a cozy ranch-style home with a big kitchen and a dining room that somehow always felt too small when we all gathered together. Mom was an incredible cook, and she always went overboard for these dinners, preparing enough food to feed twice as many people as would actually be there. Dad had built the dining room table himself when Katie and I were little, and it showed the wear of countless family meals. There were ring stains from hot dishes, scratches from homework being done in a hurry, and Katie's initials carved into one corner from when she was going through her rebellious phase at age 12. That table held 25 years of family memories, and sitting around it always made me feel grateful for the stability and love that had surrounded me my entire life. The birthday dinner started exactly like every other family celebration. Mom had been planning it for weeks, calling me multiple times to coordinate schedules and make sure everyone could attend. She'd made Dad's famous barbecue ribs, her homemade macaroni and cheese, green bean casserole, and a chocolate cake that she'd been perfecting for 20 years. The house smelled incredible when Jake and I arrived, and I could hear laughter coming from the kitchen before we even rang the doorbell. Katie was already there, telling Mom some story about a difficult cat she'd had to treat at the veterinary clinic. Dad was in his element standing at the stove and pretending to be the chef while Mom did all the actual cooking. This was their routine, and it always made me smile. Dad would hover around the kitchen, occasionally stirring something or checking the oven, while Mom orchestrated the entire meal with military precision. Michael arrived about 20 minutes after Jake and I got there, carrying a bottle of Mom's favorite wine and a beautifully wrapped gift. He hugged everyone, complimented Mom on how wonderful the house smelled, and immediately jumped into conversation with Dad about some construction project Dad was working on. This was completely normal behavior for Michael, but I noticed he seemed more fidgety than usual. He kept checking his watch and running his hands through his hair, which were nervous habits I'd never seen from him before. During cocktails in the living room, Michael kept steering the conversation toward my teaching career. He wanted to know about my tenure, about my students, about my plans for the upcoming school year. His questions were more detailed than usual, and he seemed to hang on every word of my responses. When I mentioned that I was thinking about pursuing a master's degree in education, Michael's face lit up like I'd just told him I'd won the lottery. The dinner conversation was filled with the usual family topics. Mom updated everyone on her latest drama at the bank, Dad complained about his new supervisor, and Katie entertained us with stories about the animals she'd treated that week. Michael contributed to every conversation, but I noticed he kept watching me with an intensity that made me slightly uncomfortable. When Mom brought out old photo albums after dinner, Michael's reactions to pictures of me as a child seemed overly emotional. He would study each photo like he was memorizing every detail, and I caught him wiping away tears when Mom showed him my kindergarten school picture. The evening felt perfectly normal on the surface, but there was an undercurrent of tension that I couldn't quite identify. Michael seemed like he wanted to say something, but couldn't find the words. Jake was quieter than usual, and I noticed him observing Michael's behavior with the same careful attention he gave to his design projects. Even Mom seemed slightly on edge, though she was doing her best to keep the conversation flowing and make sure everyone was having a good time. None of us knew that this would be the last family dinner where I believed I understood who I was and where I came from. The shift in the evening's atmosphere happened so suddenly that it felt like someone had flipped a switch. We were all sitting around the dining room table, finishing Mom's famous chocolate cake and sharing stories about old family vacations, when Jake's phone buzzed on the table next to his dessert plate. He glanced down at the screen and I watched his entire demeanor change in an instant. The relaxed smile disappeared from his face, replaced by an expression I'd never seen before. It wasn't concern or confusion, it was something deeper and more troubling. Jake picked up his phone and stared at the screen for what felt like forever, but was probably only 10 seconds. His face went pale, and I noticed his hand was actually shaking as he held the device. This was completely out of character for my husband, who prided himself on being unflappable in any situation. In 3 years of marriage, I'd seen him handle work crises, family emergencies, and even our car, breaking down in the middle of nowhere with complete calm and composure. "I need to take this call," Jake said, his voice tight and strained. "It's about the Peterson logo design. Sorry, but this is really important." The excuse sounded reasonable enough to everyone else at the table, but I knew immediately that something was wrong. Jake never took client calls during family time, and definitely not during Mom's birthday dinner. More importantly, the Peterson project had been completed and submitted over a week ago. I'd seen him send the final files myself, and the client had already approved everything. There was no reason for them to be calling him on a Sunday evening. I watched Jake push back from the table and walk toward the back door, his phone pressed to his ear. But here's the thing that really bothered me. He answered the phone by saying, "Hello," in a way that sounded more like he was greeting someone he knew well, not like he was taking a business call. The tone was personal, almost intimate, and it made my stomach clench with anxiety. As a teacher, I developed a sixth sense about when something was off. You learn to read body language, voice patterns, and subtle changes in behavior when you're responsible for 25 third graders every day. My radar for detecting problems had been finely tuned over 5 years of teaching, and every alarm bell in my head was going off watching Jake's behavior. The conversation at the table continued around me, but I couldn't focus on anything anyone was saying. Mom was telling Katie about some drama with her coworkers at the bank, and Dad was adding his own commentary about workplace politics, but their voices sounded like they were coming from underwater. All I could think about was the look on Jake's face when he'd seen that phone screen and the way his voice had cracked when he'd made his excuse. I kept glancing toward the back door, expecting to see Jake pacing in the backyard while he talked to whoever had called him. But from my seat at the table, I couldn't see him anywhere. The motion light in the backyard hadn't even turned on, which meant he wasn't walking around like he usually did when he took work calls. Michael seemed to notice my distraction and asked if everything was okay. I forced a smile and told him I was just tired from the school week, but I could tell he wasn't buying it. Michael had always been incredibly perceptive when it came to my moods and feelings. He could read me better than almost anyone, which I'd always attributed to him being around for so many important moments in my life. 10 minutes passed, then 15. Jake was still outside, supposedly on his business call, but something felt fundamentally wrong about the entire situation. The Peterson project was straightforward logo design work, nothing that would require a lengthy phone conversation on a Sunday evening. Even if there had been a problem, Jake would have wrapped up the call quickly and returned to the table to enjoy the rest of the evening with my family. I started mentally cataloging all the things that didn't add up. Jake's face when he'd seen the phone screen looked more like he'd received devastating news than a work call. His excuse about the Peterson project was clearly fabricated. His voice when he'd answered the phone sounded like he was talking to someone he knew personally, not a client. And now he'd been outside for almost 20 minutes, which was far too long for any normal business conversation. The worst part was that I could see Michael watching me with increasing concern. He kept glancing toward the back door and then back at me, like he was trying to figure out what was happening. There was something in his expression that made me think he might know more about Jake's strange behavior than he was letting on. I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to excuse myself from the table and find out exactly what was going on with my husband. My teacher instincts were screaming that something was seriously wrong, and I'd learned to trust those instincts completely. "I'm going to check on Jake," I announced to the table, trying to keep my voice casual. "He's been out there for a while." What I found in the backyard would shatter every assumption I'd ever made about my family and my own identity. Finding Jake crying in the backyard was like discovering that gravity had suddenly stopped working. Everything I thought I knew about my husband, about our relationship, about the predictable rhythm of our lives together, crumbled in that single moment. Jake doesn't cry. In 3 years of marriage, I'd seen him tear up exactly twice, and both times had been during monumental life events that would make anyone emotional. I stood there for a moment, frozen on the back porch trying to process what I was seeing. My husband was sitting on the wooden steps Dad had built when I was a teenager, his head buried in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. His phone was nowhere to be seen, which confirmed what I'd already suspected about the fake business call. The motion light had turned on when I opened the door, casting harsh shadows across the backyard and making the whole scene feel like something out of a nightmare. "Jake, what's going on?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady even though my heart was racing. "You're scaring me." He looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes and a face that looked like he'd aged 10 years in the past 20 minutes. This wasn't the calm, collected man I'd married. This was someone who looked like he'd just received the worst news of his life. "I can't do this here, Emma," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not with everyone inside, not with your family right there." The way he said, "your family," made my blood run cold. There was something in his tone, a distance and formality that had never been there before. Jake loved my family. He'd always been comfortable with my parents, always enjoyed our monthly dinners, always fit seamlessly into our family dynamics. But right now, he was talking about them like they were strangers. "Do what?" I demanded, moving closer to him. "What are you talking about? What can't you do?" Jake stood up and ran his hands through his hair, a nervous gesture I'd rarely seen from him. He started pacing back and forth across the small concrete patio, and I could see he was struggling to find words for whatever was tearing him apart. "I'll tell you when we get home," he finally said. "Please, Emma, just trust me on this. I need to figure out how to say this, and I can't do it here." The phrase "trust me" should have been comforting, but the way he said it made me feel like the ground was shifting beneath my feet. Jake was asking me to trust him while clearly keeping something massive from me. As a teacher, I'd learned to recognize when someone was hiding something important, and every instinct I had was screaming that whatever Jake knew was going to change everything. I looked through the dining room window and could see my family still sitting around the table, probably wondering where both Jake and I had disappeared to. Mom was cutting another piece of cake, Katie was showing Dad something on her phone, and Michael was sitting quietly, occasionally glancing toward the back door with an expression I couldn't quite read. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach drop. Michael wasn't participating in the conversation like he usually did. He was sitting there with his hands folded in his lap, staring at his coffee cup, looking like he was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. The man who was normally the life of the party, who always had a story to tell or a joke to share, was sitting in complete silence. "Jake," I said, grabbing his arm to stop his pacing, "does this have something to do with Michael?" The way his face changed when I said Michael's name told me everything I needed to know. Jake's eyes widened, and he actually took a step back from me, like I'd just solved a puzzle he'd been hoping I wouldn't figure out. "We need to leave," Jake said, his voice urgent now. "We need to go home, and we need to go now." "I'm not leaving until you tell me what's going on," I said, surprised by the firmness in my own voice. "My family is in there celebrating Mom's birthday, and you're out here having some kind of breakdown about something that apparently involves Michael. I deserve to know what's happening." Jake looked at me for a long moment, and I could see him weighing his options. He was clearly torn between wanting to protect me from whatever he knew and realizing that keeping me in the dark was no longer an option. "If I tell you," he said slowly, "everything is going to change. Everything about how you see your family, how you see yourself, how you understand your entire life up to this point. Are you sure you want to know?" The question hung in the air between us like a challenge. Part of me wanted to say no, to go back inside and pretend this conversation had never happened, to return to the comfortable ignorance of 20 minutes ago. But the teacher in me, the part that had always needed to understand and get to the bottom of things, wouldn't let me walk away. "Yes," I said, "I want to know." Jake nodded slowly, like he'd been expecting that answer but dreading it at the same time. "Then we're going home," he said, "right now." The drive home from my parents' house felt like the longest 15 minutes of my life. I'd made our excuses to my family, claiming that I had a terrible headache and needed to get home to rest before work on Monday. Mom had been concerned and wanted to send me home with leftover cake. Katie had offered to come with us to make sure I was okay, and Dad had insisted on walking us to the car. Through it all, Michael had remained strangely quiet, giving me a hug goodbye that lasted just a little too long and felt different somehow, more desperate and emotional than his usual farewell. Jake's hands were shaking on the steering wheel, and he kept taking deep breaths like he was preparing for something monumental. I'd never seen him this nervous, not even when he'd proposed to me 3 years ago. The silence in the car was suffocating, filled with the weight of whatever truth he was about to reveal. When we finally got home, I poured myself a glass of wine with hands that weren't entirely steady and settled into our living room. Jake sat across from me in his usual chair, but everything about his posture and expression was completely foreign to me. This wasn't the man who discussed our days over dinner every night or who made me laugh with his observations about his design clients. This was someone carrying a burden so heavy it was physically changing him. "Before I tell you this," Jake said, his voice carefully controlled, "I need you to know that I love you. Nothing about what I'm going to say changes how I feel about you or about our marriage. Nothing changes how proud I am of the woman you are, or how excited I am about our future together." The preamble made my heart race even faster. In my experience, conversations that started with reassurances about love and marriage were usually followed by devastating news. I set my wine glass down because my hands were shaking too much to hold it steady. "Jake, you're terrifying me," I said. "Just tell me what's going on." He took one more deep breath and looked directly into my eyes. "Emma, the man at the table tonight, Michael, he's not your cousin. He's your biological father." The words hit me like a physical blow. For a moment, I couldn't process what he'd said because it was so completely impossible. I actually laughed, a short, sharp sound that had nothing to do with humor. "That's not funny," I said. "That's not even remotely funny, Jake." "I'm not joking," he said quietly. "I wish I were, but I'm not. Michael is your father." I stood up so quickly that I knocked over my wine glass, sending red wine spreading across our coffee table. "That's impossible. Michael is Mom's cousin. I've known him my entire life. He's been at every birthday party, every graduation, every major event since I was born. He's family, but he's not my father. My father is Greg, the man who raised me, who taught me to drive, who walked me down the aisle at our wedding." Jake was watching me with an expression of pure anguish, like every word I was saying was causing him physical pain. "Emma, sit down, please. Let me explain." "Explain what?" I demanded, but I sat back down because my legs suddenly felt too weak to support me. "Explain how you could possibly think that Michael, who has never been anything but a loving cousin to me, is somehow my father? Explain how that's even remotely possible." "Because he told me," Jake said simply. "Tonight, during dinner, Michael pulled me aside when you went to help your mom in the kitchen. He said he couldn't do it anymore. He couldn't sit at that table and watch you call him cousin when he's been your father for 28 years. I felt like I was in some kind of alternate reality where nothing made sense. Even if that were true, which it's not, why would he tell you? Why wouldn't he tell me directly? "Because he's been carrying this secret for your entire life," Jake said. "Because he made a promise to your mother 28 years ago that he would respect her decision to raise you as Greg's daughter. Because he's been loving you from a distance all these years, watching you grow up, being proud of everything you've accomplished, but never being able to claim you as his own." The room was spinning, and I felt like I might be sick. "Show me proof," I said. "If this is true, show me proof." Jake reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper that looked like it had been handled countless times over many years. "He gave me this," Jake said, holding it out to me. "It's a letter your mother wrote to him when you were born." I took the paper with trembling hands and unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was unmistakably my mother's, younger and less refined than it was now, but definitely hers. The letter was dated 28 years ago, just 2 weeks after my birth. "Dear Michael," it began, "I know this is the hardest thing either of us will ever have to do, but we both know it's the right decision. Greg loves Emma like she's his own blood, and she deserves to grow up in a stable home with parents who are committed to each other and to her. You and I both know that what we had was beautiful, but it was also complicated and uncertain. I need you to promise me that you'll let Greg be her father, that you'll step back and let us build the family that Emma deserves." I couldn't read the rest because tears were blurring my vision. Everything I thought I knew about my life, about my identity, about my family, was crumbling around me. Michael wasn't my mother's cousin, who happened to be incredibly devoted to our family. He was my father, and he'd been watching me from the sidelines for 28 years, loving me in silence while respecting my mother's decision to build a different life. Suddenly, everything made perfect sense. Michael's intense interest in my education, his emotional reactions to my accomplishments, his presence at every important moment in my life, the way he seemed to understand me better than almost anyone. He hadn't been an unusually devoted cousin. He'd been a father who was forced to love his daughter from a distance. My entire understanding of who I was and where I came from had just been rewritten in a single conversation. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Instead, I sat in our living room until sunrise, holding my mother's letter and trying to piece together 28 years of memories through this shocking new lens. Jake had eventually gone to bed around midnight, but not before making me promise to wake him if I needed anything. I needed everything and nothing all at once, and sleep felt impossible when my entire understanding of myself had been turned upside down. By 6 a.m, I'd made a decision. I called in sick to work, something I'd done maybe 3 times in my entire teaching career, and told my principal I had a family emergency. It wasn't a lie. This was the biggest family emergency I could imagine, even though nobody at Lincoln Elementary would ever understand what that meant. I spent the morning going through old photo albums with fresh eyes, and the evidence of Michael's true role in my life was everywhere once I knew what to look for. In my kindergarten graduation photos, Michael wasn't just standing with the other family members. He was positioned slightly apart, like he was trying to be present but respectful of boundaries. In pictures from my high school graduation, I could see tears on his face that I'd always attributed to his emotional nature. But now, I understood were the tears of a father, watching his daughter achieve something important. The most devastating discovery was a photo from my wedding day. While everyone else was focused on the ceremony, Michael was captured in the background of one shot, watching me walk down the aisle with an expression of pure love and loss. He was seeing his daughter get married, but he had to experience it as a family friend rather than as the father of the bride. At 10 o'clock, I drove to Michael's hotel. He was staying at the Hampton Inn downtown, the same place he always stayed when he visited for family events. I'd called ahead, and he'd agreed to meet me in the hotel restaurant, though his voice on the phone had been heavy with the weight of what we both knew we needed to discuss. When I walked into the restaurant, Michael was already sitting at a corner table, looking like he'd aged a decade overnight. His usually neat appearance was disheveled. His eyes were red from crying, and his hands were shaking as he stirred sugar into his coffee. This was a man who had carried an enormous secret for nearly 3 decades, and the relief of finally sharing it was written all over his face. "Emma," he said when he saw me, standing up like he wasn't sure whether he should hug me or shake my hand. The uncertainty in his gesture broke my heart because I realized he'd probably been navigating these unclear boundaries my entire life. I hugged him, and for the first time, it felt different. It felt like hugging my father instead of hugging my mother's cousin. "We need to talk," I said, and he nodded like he'd been waiting for this conversation for 28 years. Michael told me everything. He and my mother had been involved briefly before she met my father, Greg. They'd been young and in love, but their relationship had been complicated by distance and different life goals. When Mom discovered she was pregnant, Michael had been thrilled and wanted to marry her immediately. But Mom had already fallen in love with Greg, who had offered to raise me as his own child without hesitation. "Your mother made the right choice," Michael said, his voice thick with emotion. Greg was ready to be a husband and father in ways that I wasn't at 24. I was still figuring out my career, still traveling constantly for work, still too immature to provide the stability that you and your mother needed. Greg could offer you a real family, a stable home, and parents who were committed to building a life together. The hardest part was learning that Michael had wanted to be part of my life from the beginning, but had respected my mother's decision to create clear boundaries. "I asked if I could be Uncle Michael," he said, "but your mother thought that was too close to the truth. So we settled on cousin, and I promised I would never interfere with Greg's role as your father." Michael had kept that promise religiously. He'd attended my school events, but always sat in the back. He'd sent birthday and Christmas gifts, but never anything that would upstage what my parents gave me. He'd been present for every major milestone, but always as a supportive family member, rather than as a parent. He'd watched me grow up, go to college, become a teacher, and get married, all while keeping the secret that he was my biological father. "Why now?" I asked. "Why did you decide to tell Jake last night?" Michael's answer broke my heart. "Because I'm 52 years old and I've never been married, never had other children, never built the family I always thought I would. You're my only child, Emma, and I realized I might die someday without you ever knowing that you were the greatest accomplishment of my life. I couldn't live with that anymore." That afternoon, I insisted on a family meeting. I called my parents and told them that Michael, Jake, and I needed to talk to them together. Mom knew immediately what the conversation would be about, and I could hear her crying on the phone before she even said yes. The meeting was devastating and beautiful at the same time. Mom confirmed everything Michael had told me, explaining through tears that she'd been young and scared and had made the decision she thought was best for everyone involved. Dad's reaction surprised me most of all. Instead of being angry or hurt, he looked relieved that the secret was finally out in the open. "Emma," Dad said, taking my hands in his work-roughened ones, "you've been my daughter for 28 years. Biology doesn't change that. I was there for your first steps, your first day of school, your first heartbreak, and your wedding day. I'm your father in every way that matters, and nothing about this changes that." But what Dad said next made me understand the true depth of his character. "And Michael," he continued, turning to face the man who had given me life, "thank you for trusting me to raise your daughter. Thank you for respecting our family while still being part of Emma's life. You could have made this complicated, but you chose to put Emma's well-being first, and I'll always be grateful for that." The months that followed were an adjustment period for all of us. I learned to navigate having two fathers, each of whom had played crucial but different roles in shaping who I became. Greg remained Dad, the man who had raised me and taught me everything I knew about strength, integrity, and unconditional love. Michael became a different kind of father, someone I could talk to about the parts of myself that I'd inherited from him, like my love of photography and my tendency to overthink everything. The most beautiful discovery was that I hadn't lost anything by learning the truth. Instead, I'd gained a deeper understanding of how many people had loved me throughout my life. Greg had chosen to be my father when he didn't have to. Michael had chosen to love me from a distance to protect the family structure that was best for me. Mom had made impossible decisions to give me the most stable childhood possible. As a teacher, I thought I understood family dynamics, but I learned that the most complex family was my own. I learned that love isn't just about blood relations. It's about the people who choose to show up, day after day, in whatever capacity they're allowed. I learned that sometimes the biggest secrets are kept not to hurt us, but to protect us. And I learned that sometimes the most beautiful love stories are the ones that happen in silence, where someone loves you so much they're willing to step back and let someone else be the hero in your story. Today, my students sometimes ask me about my family, and I tell them I'm incredibly lucky because I have two fathers who love me in different but equally important ways. I tell them that family isn't just about who shares your DNA. It's about who chooses to love you and support you throughout your life. The truth didn't destroy my family. It made me realize just how extraordinary my family had always been. And if you enjoyed this story and want to hear more real-life experiences about family, relationships, and the unexpected ways our lives can change overnight, please subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss a new video. Your support means everything to me, and it helps me continue sharing these important stories that remind us we're not alone in our experiences. I'll see you in the next video, and remember, sometimes the most complicated families are also the most loving ones.